2.5 years ago, I released a long-form video called Steven Universe's Garbage and Here's Why, which did gangbusters for my channel, and it's probably what brought most of you here. Or it might have been the other way. Actually, hang on, let's back up. Several years ago, I watched that Fallout 3 video from H-Bomb and thought, that looks like a lot of fun. I want to do one of those. It'd be neat. So I did one on The Legend of Korra because it was the one show I watched recently that I completely and totally fucking hated. By all accounts, it's not very good. I stand by a lot of my criticism, but I think it could do with more polish, and since it was made to scratch an itch, I did a lot of line ripping from H-Bomber guy. Basically, I didn't expect this video to get popular, and then it did, and now I feel guilty about it. It really was just something I did for fun than anything else. I decided to do another one when Steven Universe reached the point where I was completely done with this war crime masquerading as a cartoon. This was the one I sat down and did completely seriously and not just to have fun. But because Steven Universe was, at the time, something of a sacred cow, it prompted a sizable backlash. Some of it was thought-provoking and made me re-examine how I do criticism, but a lot of it was airheaded weirdos conveniently forgetting what an executive producer is, and taking the last segment where I say, is Rebecca Sugar a Nazi or a dumbass? Obviously she's a dumbass, as me saying that Rebecca Sugar is a Nazi. And guys, if you're gonna lie, try not to use a lie that's immediately uncovered with big bold print. But the segment that prompted a lot of this stuff was the one I feel was the most important issue with the series, and I want to do the YouTuber version of when artists redraw an old drawing to compare and show the improvement in my critical spectrum and see how things are different from when I make it while not being at the apex of an abusive relationship. Fun, huh? Let me let you in on a little writing secret. The biggest lie any creator will ever tell you is that everything was planned from the start. Nothing ever is. Changes and new ideas happen all the time, and only so much planning can ever be done. The only point where you can say all the planning has been done is at the very end of pre-production when the scripts are finalized and the voice actors have to twist themselves in knots trying to make your garbage dialogue sound realistic. All creators make shit up as they go along at least 50% of the time, and any creator who says everything was planned from the start is lying their ass off to you. It is physically impossible to do that. This was planned from the start as something that is never said in response to praise because it doesn't need to be said. It's only ever said in response to criticism. It's the writer equivalent of, oh, I meant to do that, or when a hack artist responds to criticism with, that's my style. I bring this up because the executive producer of Steven Universe is really fond of saying that, despite the show being so disjointed, laden with retcons disguised as misdirections, and leaving so many plot threads hanging that even Tetsuya Nomura would say Sugar needs to get her fucking shit together. And the Diamonds have suffered the most from how scattershot and disjointed the series is. At first, they were an enigma in the story, but were quickly set up as the series' main antagonists. From that point onward, it was clear that nobody had any idea what they wanted the Diamonds to be. They flitted back and forth between callous rootlessness and traumatized wooby that they might as well be replaced with literally any female character in a Blizzard game.
I'm sorry, Bismuth, but it's not right.
That's exactly what she said.
Huh?
That's exactly what you said.
Look, I can't waste time speculating on what they might have been, only what they are. And what they are is an unholy hybrid of fantasy space Nazi and abuse of family members, a sort of mutant hybrid of Arthas Menethil and Marty Armstrong. The Diamonds are Nazis in space. That statement alone is contentious because it makes the show's coddling and redemption of them harder to defend. People will very quickly get into nitpicks about fascist ideology and the difference between totalitarians and fascists, and it's all mostly a deflection tactic because if you accept the premise that the Diamonds are space fascists, then the show is immediately cast in a negative light because it breaks the one golden rule of writing this sort of thing. Nazis are cannon fodder villains. They're a universally monstrous breed of subhuman filth who deserve neither empathy or second chances. And oftentimes fictitious recreations of them will use very rinsed-off variations of them into regular totalitarians to avoid treading into the heavy subject of what happens when you let white supremacists into power. But in Steven Universe, they don't. The Diamonds run a racial caste system where certain gems are arbitrarily considered better than others, they openly revile non-standard relationships, they execute the disabled or otherwise different, and they position themselves as objectively better than the gems beneath them. Oh yeah, and they also practice chattel slavery and put people they think are beneath them into camps. Zoos. That's not better. Look, I'm not here to debate whether the Diamonds are Nazis or not. They are. There isn't any significant argument against it. That isn't just arguing semantics, as though committing genocide under a different banner is somehow more palatable. Whether it was intentional or not, they are Nazis, and they were written that way from the start. They're not characters who were woefully mishandled or rewritten to suit the narrative of a numbskull. This was just how they were designed, and the latter half of the show goes away from this diverse cast of charming characters living their best lives to being all about the myth of changing a Nazi's mind. You know, if I had a nickel for every time a science fiction series changed direction mid-run to thirst over ugly-ass space Nazis, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. It's hard to remember this because Steven Universe did a good job of tricking people into thinking it was all one long, interconnected story, but early on the series moved from one story arc to the next with very little overlap. It was like an episodic show with really long episodes. And here's the rub. A lot of them are really good. As self-contained stories, they're really, really good. The story arc leading up to Lapis's escape is really good. The cluster and Peridot learning the greater value in life is really good and contains my favorite moment in the entire series. And everyone loves the invasion. I don't even need to talk about it, it's really good. The show has always had its issues and its creepiness, but it was a lot easier to ignore when it was still telling very good and, at its core, very heartfelt stories. The issues reached a head in Bismuth.
Shattering gems. Wouldn't that make us the same as Homeworld?
Of course not!
This is difficult to talk about. Not because it's a complicated issue, mind. It's not. Steven Universe makes the claim that killing a tyrant makes you as bad as them. It doesn't. That statement is just wrong no matter how you spin it. Objectively, morally, pragmatically, it is wrong. Steven is wrong. Rebecca Sugar is wrong. Anyone who has ever said this in regards to works of fiction and real life is wrong. But there will people who will adamantly, stubbornly, and obsessively defend it with well-poisoning and thought-terminating cliches like, "So you just want a bloodbath?" and "So I guess Compassion is dead now?" These are inherently bad faith rebuttals, and there's no argument you can make to convince them because it's not a real defense of the story. It's just an attempt to shout over you, drown you out, and embarrass you into being quiet. A lot of people, and I used to do this too, will give the people making this defense the benefit of the doubt and operate as if they don't understand the reality of the situation. But they aren't stupid. This is a stand tactic because they just want to protect the thing they love from criticism, and they're not arguing in good faith. The fact is that if I need to tell you why killing genocidal tyrants is not actually a bad thing, then you're way too young to be on YouTube, and you are way too young to be making cartoons. But this argument is never made sincerely. Nobody actually believes this. The only people who repeat it are white or white-passing people whose entire system of morality is based on glorifying passivity and nonviolence for nonviolence's sake. Or they're actual literal fascists trying to argue against something that would directly target them.
If you kill me, you'll be no better than me. I can live with that.
Most alt-right tactics in 2021 rely heavily on gaslighting the left into not doing anything to stop them. Fascism and totalitarianism can't succeed in an environment of open hostility, so they do everything they can to ensure they don't have one, and that is the core point of this gaslighting tactic, because it plays on your ego. Good people don't kill, good people spare their enemies, good people show mercy. You're a good person, aren't you? But this isn't being a good person, this is just behaving, being undisruptive, quiet, not being an inconvenience, being ignorable. This is something that Steven Universe brushes up against on occasion, but it never really sticks around long enough to explore. Because the story is pushing a narrative of non-violence being the best solution to a problem, most of the underlying issues and consequences are never addressed. Let me present a crazy idea for you. Non-violent solutions are the best solutions should not be a lesson for the hero, it should be a lesson for the villain. People often invoke Martin Luther King when they talk about this stuff, kind of like I'm doing right now, but the thing about the civil rights era is that Jim Crow wasn't abolished because the people in power were convinced through reasoned debate. The Democrats didn't create and sign the 4 different civil rights acts because they were seriously convinced by the respectable arguments presented before them. They did it because the only alternatives were listen to the people presenting nonviolent solutions or start having all your shit wrecked. In fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was written because every city was rioting. Because when it comes to human rights, or in the case of Steven Universe, gem rights, there is no actual debate to be had. People's right to exist in a fair society is not actually something that's up for debate. And if you want to pretend that people's rights are up for debate, don't be surprised when they decide to walk with you to that pier. Non-violent solutions are an implicit threat. Steven Universe's approach to non-violence and pacifism isn't just some twee hope punk optimist power fantasy. It's an actual real-life gaslighting tool used by people in power to make civil unrest easier to ignore and quell, because nothing is easier to destroy than someone who refuses to fight back. King was a big proponent of non-violent protest, but they killed him anyway and stuck his words in the mouths of villains for decades to come.
I think you're confusing peace with quiet.
Also, King was non-violent, but he wasn't anti-violence, just saying. This problem with the show carries all the way to Change Your Mind, where Steven manages to completely win over White Diamond with a comeback.
You're just acting like a child! I am a child. What's your excuse?
Change Your Mind reveals another issue with Steven Universe that isn't talked about. The protagonist is awful. Like, just straight up awful. Steven is the moral center of the show. He is never wrong, people who challenge him are villainized, and ultimately all of his ideas work without failure. And I don't necessarily object to a moral center protagonist, I've written my fair share of them. I respect a creator who comes out and says, this is my message, we're doing it. My issue is a pretty simple one. The moral center is off kilter. Among a cast of characters this large and this literally and metaphorically colorful, the moral center of the show is a myopic, cisgendered, heterosexual white man who believes violence against the violent is wrong, actively silences literal and coded people of color, and never stops trying to extend a hand to genocidal tyrants who are hell-bent on destroying everyone and everything except him because he is one of them and therefore has nothing to lose. Steven is a played straight version of Brian Griffin.
And I'm sure that Ida, more than anyone else here, can understand and support the choice that Kevin made. I do not understand Kevin's choice, and I do not support it. Okay, well that's just some dumb drag queen.
Steven as a character plays out a lot like a family-friendly version of those painfully white bread tubers who openly spew slurs, accuse trans people of being fake except the one or two they personally like, cuddle up to Nazis, TERFs, and white supremacists, deride identity politics as a distraction, cry about cancel culture, and then turn around with a totally straight face and say they're de-radicalizing the alt-right. When it's time for Steven to do his usual talking the monster down, everyone just stands back and obeys him without question. Oftentimes the other characters aren't even allowed to have an opinion on the matter. It's brute forced that badly. Moral center characters will often have conversations or arguments with other disagreeing characters that they can't just write off, even if it's just to explore or flesh out the main central philosophy of the story. It's a good way to approach and close off counterpoints that the writer thinks genuinely won't work. The moral center of the story has to explain and defend themselves. It fundamentally strengthens the case they're trying to make. Of course, it can also expose holes in the case they're trying to make, but that's the risk you take when you're message mongering. But in Steven's case, those characters are often just quiet. I find there was a severely missed opportunity for Steven to argue with Garnet in regards to the diamonds, but that comes with two big problems. One, a teenage boy white-splaining to a black woman about what is to be done about the space Nazis would be really fucking hard to sell as a positive, even if it didn't have to contend with. Number two, the main central problem with this entire premise is that Steven is wrong, and the show pretends he isn't. Everything else I'm about to say about the dangerous precedent this concept sets or the almost vindictive hatred of trauma survivors it represents are all secondary to this. Steven's philosophy of offering a hand is portrayed in the show as the correct way to approach these problems, and that Steven is in the right to do it. But they are not, and he is not. The show has to go to some pretty extreme lengths to make Steven's ideas work. If it weren't for the fact that his gem is a diamond, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have worked at all. Now, there are a whole host of arguments to defend this position, my personal favorites being, oh, the diamonds are crucial to gem culture, and without them, the gems would die off. And, oh, but it did work. Steven changed their mind, look. But these are just Thermian arguments. The diamonds are only crucial to gem culture because the creator chose to make them that way. And she only did that to contrive a reason for why they can't be killed. You could replace they're crucial to gem culture with they're just too good and powerful and amazing and special and invulnerable with awesome tits, and it would have made just as much sense. Likewise with changing their minds. By all reasonable accounts, the diamonds shouldn't have been that easily convinced with such piffy nonsense. By all accounts, they shouldn't have given a shit about the corrupted gems, but they aren't thinking, breathing people who can form their own opinions. They can only say or do what the creator wants them to do. It ultimately doesn't matter what might have made sense for the character to do. If the creator wants them to do it, they're gonna fucking do it. Look, the thing is that while Steven Universe is often praised for an ideology of radical empathy, it only ever practices that empathy for a select few people. Steven is not the all-loving hero that sees good in everyone that fans make him out to be. He'll go to extreme lengths to reach out to Space Hitler and Uncle Maga, but other characters like Kevin and even non-antagonistic characters like Bismuth get far worse treatment. In Bismuth's case, it makes a certain amount of twisted, evil sense because Bismuth actively refuted the show's narrative, but there's a consistent theme of non-white coded characters being villainized or talked down to, while white coded characters are given a lot more patience and understanding. The only good example of Steven's empathy as a story theme is with Peridot, and the reason it works is because it's the only real time Steven has shown sincere empathy to one of Homeworld's victims. Peridot isn't a high-ranking member of Homeworld, she's a bottom-level serf. She's basically the maintenance girl. And while she's with the Crystal Gem, she experiences a freedom and self-identity she didn't know existed, and it's something she deserved to have. It's the one time Steven's empathy is actually a touching and heartwarming part of the show, when it's shown to someone who sincerely deserved it, when it's shown to a victim of abuse and not the perpetrator. And it's something Steven absolutely should have done, but most of the time, he doesn't. And this lopsided focus only ever has the effect of making Steven look like a dick. Steven might show empathy for the villains, but he's a prick to almost everybody else. Imagine being in Garnet's position and having to watch your son insist that the people who tried to have you executed for lesbian crimes are family. If Garnet were allowed to have agency, I'd imagine that would hurt. Like, a lot. People, including the creator, insist that the Diamonds are a closer analog to abusive and dysfunctional family members than they are totalitarian dictators. And it's not the first time that parallel has been drawn in a character, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. So fine, I'll walk with you to that pier. Strip away the pretense and get right down to the meat and gristle. In terms of personal stakes, the Diamonds are the abusers of every single character in the main cast except Steven and Amethyst. Even Rose was abused by them, and so every single character has to watch as Steven keeps trying to extend an empathetic hand to their abusers. Constantly. It smacks way too hard of that whole forgive your abusers because drinking poison blah blah blah. And I don't know how to explain this to people who haven't suffered abuse in their lives, but no. Just know, this is a form of victim blaming, to tell an abuser's sob story and force sympathy out of them. It's one of the methods that abusers keep their victims ensnared by playing on their empathy. It's something I've been subjected to, and I would find something beautifully poetic about a cishet white boy thinking he's the first person to consider trying to change an abuser's mind if it weren't for the fact that doing that is something the show wholeheartedly endorses. It slings a lot of sympathy for the Diamonds, and no regard is given to their victims. It's not even that the show is openly hostile to victims, it just doesn't consider their feelings on the matter to be worth thinking about at all, which is a form of hostility, but a different kind of turning around and saying that victims are the real abusers, or randomly making an abuse victim into the villain because of the cultural myth of the cycle of abuse.
Only one of us wanted this war.
You call for peace when it suits you, little lion. But you're quick enough to kill.
And the way the show completely bends over backwards to show how sad and grieving the Diamonds are, downplay their crimes and deny their victims any real justice, while contriving reasons for why the Diamonds have to be kept alive or all of Gemkind will die. It's just mean. It's unbelievably fucking mean. Despite the claims of radical empathy and weaponized optimism, Steven Universe is an extremely bitter, mean show. And all in the service of what? The white fantasy that if you pick the right words and have the right tone that you'll magically convince Nazis and abusers to change their mind to become better people? To reassure yourself that the problem isn't that some people are just mean, but that all the others were just too loud and uppity and angry? To perpetuate the myth that abuse victims, LGBTA people, and people of color are doomed to fail unless they placate their white, cishet, neurotypical allies? This is where we land with that question from earlier, and let's extrapolate and reword it a bit. Is Rebecca Sugar one of the malicious individuals perpetuating that myth so that people fighting for social change will waste their time, resources, and energy having debates with America's Andes? Or is she just one of the many people who is stupid and gullible enough to believe that it works? Because a lot of white people do believe in that notion, that the most important thing in the world is getting bigots back on our side over the people they are bigoted against. But I'm gonna make this very plain to you. That is a lie. And it is a lie perpetuated by white supremacists to muscle people of color and LGBTA people out of the conversation. They want you wasting your time having debates with them and trying to reach out to them so that they can slowly radicalize and gaslight you while you aren't doing anything useful, like voting out bigoted politicians, advocating for voter reenfranchisement and redistricting, or focusing your attention on anything that might look like it doesn't revolve around white men. And it's a grift that people believe. People who sell themselves as political philosophers buy into this absolute horse shit. I'm not surprised that an art school brat with the brain of a Cabbage Patch Kid bought it hook, line, and sinker. But it is complete horse shit. Your value as a leftist or even as a person does not hinge on whether or not you can change Andy's mind. Despite ostensibly talking about the Diamonds, I've stayed focused on Steven for the most part, and that's because the Diamonds ultimately don't matter. Their motivations, their pain, their grief, all of that only becomes present in the story because Steven makes the conscious decision to give them the time of day. Steven is the vector through which all of this works. He is the main character of the show, and the villains are not. Villains are not primary characters. They're not even secondary characters. They're a plot device. They exist to challenge the protagonist and further their character arc in some way. And the worst villains ever made are the ones that don't do that. The Diamonds exist to be the ultimate final boss for Steven's empathy. They're what all other examples have been building up to, and of course he succeeds. Show me any story that ends with the bad guy winning that wasn't intended as a cautionary tale. The bad guy fails because the protagonist rises to the challenge they represent. The Diamonds are a means to an end. Steven is ultimately the main central focus of this thesis, and he's an unbelievable bastard. He's indirectly cruel to so many people, and oftentimes they're the people he's supposedly closest to. His perception of morality, empathy, and kindness is horridly warped. His empathy is reserved for only a few specific people who are often the most responsible for the problems everyone has been facing. Here's a question for you. Does Stephen love his mother? I'm not talking about Rose, I'm talking about Garnet, like the actual mother figure in his life. Does Stephen love his mother? Most people would say yes. I mean, he has to, right? That's his mom. Here's the thing. I've not seen anything in the show to tell me that Stephen loves her. There are little inklings in the first season, but nothing that really establishes that. Garnet absolutely loves Stephen. That's something that is routinely demonstrated.
Stephen, I see so many things that can hurt you. I should never have let one of them be me.
No! Stephen, it's all us!
But we made him feel like it was his fault.
Can't just hand Stephen over to Blue Diamond. She's a shatterer.
But I can't think of any instance where that love is returned. Stephen openly calls the Diamonds family. These are the people who tried to kill his mother. I'm fully prepared to accept that this might just be a me thing, but if somebody hurt and tried to kill somebody I love, I wouldn't ever want them anywhere near me. And if somebody I loved actively chose to continue associating with someone who seriously hurt me, I'd consider that a horrible betrayal. Does Stephen love his mother? If he does, he has a very funny way of showing it. A hypothetical good version of Steven Universe would have to involve Steven facing the fact that his actions have consequences, and I can only speculate on how the other characters would feel because they're not allowed to have agency in these moments. Garnet expressing hurt or betrayal at Steven's behavior would cast doubt on his choices. It would paint them as, at the very least, gray. And it wouldn't even have to be an argument. Steven would have to just turn around and see the hurt on her face. People have tried to push back against criticism of the Diamonds' redemption storyline by pointing out interviews where the crew say that Steven hasn't forgiven the Diamonds for their crimes. But that's the problem, isn't it? Whether or not the Diamonds are to be forgiven is not Steven's decision to make. And then there's Future. I'm only going to cover a little bit about it. Fans will claim that it's a realistic portrayal of mental illness and post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not. Like, I'm not even going to debate that with you. It's not. I'll sum it up really quickly. Steven should not have to turn into a monster for people to realize he's been through a lot of absolute bullshit and that he needs help. Like, you still deserve emotional support even if you can't turn into a monster. And while the road to recovery is long, it's one you can walk. There, done. The point I want to make is how Steven behaves throughout the show. As time goes on, Steven becomes more unstable, borderline manipulative and abusive towards others, and at one point just flat out murders Jasper. Oh, but it's okay because shattered gems can be repaired, which immediately renders the ethical questions of shattering the Diamonds moot. Good job, Becky, you tried. You get a sticker. But the thing is that while this was considered a novel idea for Future, this isn't really a change from how Steven usually behaves. He was always manipulative, abusive, and acted like a bully towards others from the Cluster arc onward. The only thing that's different is that his sanctimony is gone, and his excuses for doing so are far less elaborate. The show frames his behavior in a more explicitly negative way. Steven has been known to throw tantrums when he doesn't get his way, and it's only now that people look at that and go, hey, I think something is wrong. There's a bit where White Diamond actually lets Steven take control of her to see things from his perspective, and Steven's response is to try and murder her for everything she's put him through. It's telling that the only thing on Steven's mind is what the antagonists have done to him, and not what they've done to everybody else. For a show ostensibly about empathy, there's surprisingly little. This could have been an interesting exploration of Steven's behavior and how he treats others, but they ultimately fixated on a really simplistic and simultaneously dense portrayal of PTSD. Like, they Googled a lot of raw scientific data on PTSD, but then portrayed the treatment and characterization like a villain arc waiting to happen. This is all part of the core central issue with Steven Universe. Steven's treatment of other people, his egotistic approach to empathy and self-sacrifice, and his borderline abusive behavior towards others aren't really addressed outside of this one very clumsily handled story arc because the narrative doesn't see his behavior as a problem, even though it very much is. And that's the main issue in a nutshell. Steven Universe is a show praised to high heaven for being this uber progressive show, for portraying LGBTI relationships in an extremely positive light, for portraying non-white characters in an extremely positive light, for having a main character who's a gender non-conforming and it's none of these things. At all. It's not uber progressive. It coddles oppressors and tone polices the oppressed. It either villainizes, silences, or fetishizes non-white or non-white coded characters. It keeps most LGBTA representation under a veil and under metaphor and can't be bothered to introduce human LGBTA characters until its epilogue. And the main character is a gender-conforming, cisgendered, heterosexual white boy whose idea of being progressive is Nazis are people too. This is the kind of progressivism seen in white people whose only concern is class and capitalism. and who've never so much as spoken to an LGBT person or a person of color, or who their only exposure to such are people who are themselves intensely bigoted. Sugar has always given me that vibe of someone who could potentially be very progressive, but has convinced herself that she has nothing left to learn. And the one time she hasn't given me that vibe was when faced with a backlash over an act of negligence that was wholly indefensible. I find Steven Universe's approach to empathy and even morality to be extremely disturbing, but I'm not surprised. I was surprised at first, but we live in a post-Brid 2 world. I'm not surprised by this kind of softened bigotry and hyperfixation on redeeming villains being passed off as progressive. I've been critical of modern media's fixation on sympathetic villains and redemption arcs for years, and now we have a subset of progressives who are pathologically obsessed with de-radicalizing Nazis and derides any criticism of racism, homophobia, or transphobia against themselves as cancel culture. And Steven Universe didn't create those people. The white moderate has always been a thing as far back as the civil rights era, but it's no less infuriating as a concept. What makes Steven Universe such an anger-inducing show to watch is that there are so many moments where it looks like the creator might just be starting to get what's wrong with what they're doing, only to pull back and sink right back into white moderate BS. I spent way too long pontificating on the ethical failures of a show when the main problem is extremely simple. Everything the show says about morality and empathy is wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's damaging. It's an unhealthy outlook to have that puts undue pressure on people to try changing the minds of people for whom the resources to become better people already exist. And I need to end on this note. Steven Universe posits the idea that you can change an abuser's mind or a fascist's mind, but therapy and scientific research already exist. The tools and resources for an abuser or a conservative to become better, healthier, happier people already exist. The reason that they haven't taken them is because they don't want to, and it's up to them to change themselves. It's not your responsibility to do it for them and hold their hands through it. Your value as a person does not hinge on whether or not you can change Uncle Andy's mind.